Hello everyone, I'm here today to talk about blockchain and Bitcoin. Here's our roadmap. So at first I want to introduce myself. My name is Sarah Tobias. I'm an IC auditor by trade, and Dr. Ann Kunke is my professor here at the University of Detroit Mercy. I'm in the master's program for computer information science. I'd like to share some shape-shifting ideas with you regarding your mindset regarding blockchain, some challenges with its safety implementation, and some takeaways. The objective for today is to explain blockchain technology and talk about how it's used for transactions, and then some things you can be doing to be more safe. So blockchain is a technology in its simplest form that builds upon itself, and there's 5 points I'd like to focus on today. Thinking about blockchain as an understructure. So one of the things its biggest benefits is that it makes it more efficient. It does that by using decentralized technology. So that's the second piece, where all the transactional records are shared by all the network participants. So anyone with access rights to that transaction can trace that transactional event. It builds 1 over 1 over 1. So that distributed ledger, what we call is record keeping. Basically, it's all of the transactions are recorded by each node, and so it can track and add one number on to it to build a new block. The third piece I would say is that the records are unique, so they're all what we call cryptographically signed, which means they're encrypted. So each transaction specifically creates a timestamp. And the last is the piece where we say it's immutable, but basically it means it's unchangeable. It sort of solves the problem of double spending, so where you overdraw your account. So I can send you a picture of a cat, and then I can also send you that same picture to someone else. Blockchain is the underlying technology that creates the unique record and entry that can only be used once. It adds that to that link, so the records that are created cannot be reversed, even with artificial intelligence or quantum computing. That transaction can't be changed, and I think that's one of the biggest features of it. Can't be reversed or altered. There was one exception a few years ago where there had to be a vote of the majority of participants and what they call forking the original chain. So there's 2 different versions of currency that happen within the specific type of Bitcoin. But that's considered an application or unit of exchange based off blockchain technology. So that's where I said, well, blockchain is the original technology. So a little bit more on that. So I mentioned earlier that the access rights can be reviewed with certain transactions with that decentralization. So that support is called proof of work or proof of stack. You might hear of that. How you could think of it in another way is when you hear the term Bitcoin mining. What the people are doing is using their computers or someone else's computing power to decrypt that block and sort of process those transactions. And so when you process a transaction and build that encryption, unencrypt and then re-encrypt it, that work is called the proof of work, and that's how they get rewarded for doing that computing power and that work by getting a piece of like a quarter of a Bitcoin. One of the things I would explain another way, we mentioned blockchain is the understructure. It's sort of like dial tone or TCP/IP. It's early in its technology life. Bitcoin is just the first application of it. So there are a couple other currencies called Ethereum. That's also built on the blockchain platform and uses Bitcoin as a unit of exchange, but it gives some extra code that allows the use of programmable contracts in the different exchange values, which execute automatically when programming conditions are met. So that's more where you get into the additional security. It's starting to be used also, blockchain is, in other applications like logistics and supply chain tracking, and I'll talk through an example of what that is. So here I want to share with you an example that you might be familiar with. So I mentioned Bitcoin. Blockchain allows Bitcoin to happen. So it includes the ability to record exchanges of digital assets. So this is where the cryptocurrencies that you might be familiar with, Bitcoin, Litecoin, Ethereum is more popular, Bitcoin Cash, and there's also some other applications called privacy coins, which limits amounts exchanged in the participating wallets. There's also other coins like utility and stable coins. So think of that as like US savings bonds. So they're pretty safe if you want to keep your Bitcoin safe. That's a coin like that will keep it safe for you. There's also storage. So when you physically go to the bank, there's a vault, somewhere that has your money in it theoretically. So in blockchain, it's pure digital and it's stored in the blockchain, which is tracked through, like I mentioned, that distributed ledger. It's basically a public record book that records the transaction. You get it through a card, so a digital card, a virtual card, and instead of storing it like I mentioned in a bank account, the blockchain stores the records. There are vendors that have wallets online, and I'm depicting one here as Coinbase, or this is an example of a wallet. And in order to access those assets, you need the address's private key. From a security perspective, anyone that has that address's private key can spend the assets in that address. So just like your bank account, if you were the only one with that address specific private key, you and you alone can access those accounts. No company can do that for you. So not even the digital wallet holder. So if you lose that key, it's gone. Governments and everything. You can't call a help desk and get your password reset. So this is why you hear about people forgetting or losing their passwords. No one can reset it for them or intervene to move it to another account. Like I mentioned, here's the example of a crypto wallet. You can use services like that. There's Exodus, Coinbase is here, and a blockchain wallet are examples of ones you can use. So let's talk about real life, right? So Amazon is starting to accept it, but only through third parties. I think the next big step would be integrating Visa and MasterCard networks. They get a cut of every transaction through what's called interchange fees. So merchants pay a little percentage to the Visa or MasterCard in exchange for accepting that and allowing those kinds of transactions. So those existing banks and networks want to get in on the game too. So they're starting to develop their own virtual card systems, which are starting to be offered through the public. You might have heard of these as advertising in YouTube videos. There's one called privacy.com that offers virtual cards. Some of the vendors or retailers, I should say, that accept virtual currencies, Amazon, like I mentioned, this is an example through an extension called Lightning. Overstock, Disney, Shopify, Lush, Domino's, Uber Eats, there's more retailers are starting to accept it. Restaurants on the web, so Twitch, Pirate Bay, 4chan, ExpressVPN. Some governments are also starting to work with it in China and in Sweden mostly. Remax London offers, you can buy property with it. Tesla, Microsoft is starting to as well. And in gaming, Zynga accepts it. GameStop, Valve and Steam used to, but they stopped accepting it. So that's one of the ways you'll see it in real life. Like I mentioned, it's starting to be accepted. You'll see this, like I mentioned, in other technologies. So like I mentioned earlier, logistics. So Maersk Shipping Lines uses this as part of their blockchain, as part of their supply chain. So when you think if you order something from another country, there's customs requires a certain amount of information and paperwork basically to allow that shipment to come into the country. So there's a packing list, a bill of lading, customs clearance, because it can't be fruits and vegetables, things like that, and a prepaid invoice. So Maersk adopted this as part of their supply chain with their shipping line. So when shipments are coming back and forth, they're using blockchain to process that. It uses the big proponent of it is that consensus mechanism that they really trust. They did create, though, a separate LLC to process those transactions because from a security risk, they wanted to keep some information private. So like the fees they charge, things like that to competitors, they wouldn't want them known. Let's talk about some safety challenges. So this is an example of digital wallet where there's multi-signature security, but the risks continue to escalate. So hackers are always trying to disrupt the blockchain to see if they can find vulnerabilities. So here's what I wanted to talk about, some ways that you can be more secure. I think there was a quote I really liked that said by Peter Drucker. It says, the greatest danger in times of turbulence is not the turbulence, but it's to act with yesterday's logic. So it is difficult to keep on top of all the cybersecurity challenges. This is why people have jobs, right? It's their profession is to study these and to keep on top of it. And there are ways we can fight back just from a user perspective. So the biggest risk from an audit perspective that I see is unauthorized access. So I use LastPass. It's a password manager. It's a pretty easy app that you can use. And also, one of the things that I like about it, and iPhone started to do this too, is where it checks whether that password is being used in multiple accounts. We call that daisy chaining. So that happens a lot where once you get access to, especially your email, they'll try that same password on different banks and things like that and social media to see whether they can get in. And once they have a couple different applications, they can get full control. So I would definitely look for that on your app store to see if you can use that. The reason why I would say that's especially important, there's no one to call if you forget your password for your account. So that's one of the things you might want to consider, actually, and sounds the opposite, but writing it down. So store your private key to your digital wallets offline, so on a removable USB or external hard drive. If you have to write it on a piece of paper and put it in your safe, like in a literal safe place, do that. That's one of the things that people have lost millions of dollars because they can't get to their account. The next thing I would say is cybersecurity attacks. So I think using the latest and greatest wallet vendors, I think there's some safety in choosing a company that's a little bit bigger, that has the ability to pay for and support a cybersecurity program and protection. For example, there was a company called DAO that was hacked and $60 million of Ether was stolen. So that was the fork I mentioned before. They had to decide who was going to reverse that transaction or not. They voted on it. So that was one of the risks there. You want to be able to go with a company that can afford to fight back against these hackers and have the security in place. Another risk I would say is social engineering. So this is something I test for as an IT auditor. Bitcoin has seen specific attacks related to the victim mentioned earlier, where they get the phone numbers ported to attacker devices. So this is where they're manipulating using creative means that's not specifically asking for your bank account information. They're trying to get a phone number ported to a new device, and so they'll go into a store and say they lost their phone and they need the phone number changed. So I would say put check mark on your to-do list, or an item on your to-do list, to use two-factor authentication where it is. So this is pretty easy when you go into your security and your specific apps to try to authenticate that. There's 99% chance nothing will happen, and the attackers, will happen to the attackers, and that transactions that they enact are irreversible. So having two-factor authentication and complex passwords helps slow them down. One thing I would say, if you get those phone calls, I don't answer my phone if it's unknown numbers, but if they do get through to you, don't be afraid to be rude to them and push back. You don't have to respond to people asking you for your phone number and things like that. Don't be afraid to ask why. You can also use passphrases for security questions. So don't actually answer your first elementary school or the city you were born in. You can use other phrases it could be related, but for security phrases related to that. It could include maybe the year you were born and the current year or something like that, but just different combinations of complexity slows them down. They're also a risk as far as confidence, right? So that Bitcoin and Ether, they're cryptocurrencies, so they're not backed by government or gold, where you see those signs in the US banks. There's always a question of when you should take your money out. From a permanence perspective, I see it as sort of the confidence is generally there now. It's not something that's necessarily going to go away. Blockchain definitely will not. But I would see it as something as gambling. So if you are taking a risk by using this kind of currency. One other way you can get over that is using a burner card or a prepaid card for moving account balances. And one last thing is check if your wallet provider uses multi-signature digital wallets, like I have pictured here, where there's two or more private keys stored separately. to transfer funds from a specific address. So a couple examples of these are Trezor, Trezor, Cold Card, and Ledger. So here's the takeaways. So from an actions perspective, make a to-do list in your list, starting with a Bitcoin wallet, email, social media. So focus on those three to use a password manager. Start with those. If you can, put in the two-factor authentication and change your security passphrases and answers. I've seen this specifically with social engineering, where someone was able to social engineer guessing their passphrases. So I think the question was, what's your favorite dessert? And they were able to manipulate the customer service rep, to say, starts with a P, that kind of thing. So people tend to be nice. So like I mentioned earlier, push back and ask why people are asking. And then if you use complex, it'll make it a little bit harder. So you've got the to-do list, the password manager, security passphrases, and the authentication. So the last thing I would mention is have a plan. So use well-known wallet apps. Have a plan. This sounds strange, but if you get arrested, and a loss plan. So what you would do if you lost your phone. So like if someone ported your phone number away, what would you do? And if you get arrested, who would you call? So I would call a specific person and let them know that they're my person, and maybe have a safe word like I do with my family, where if I want someone to pick them up, a child, that we use a special word that only they know. But let that person know, your grandmother, for example, or your parents, I'm not going to call you if I get arrested. And if I do, this is a special word that you'll know it's me, like the name of your first dog or something like that. But lastly, like I mentioned earlier, don't be afraid to push back and ask why. So I hear that a lot when you're going in to buy, in Michigan, where I'm at, medical marijuana. They ask for your phone number. You don't have to provide it. CVS is the same thing. You can use another phone number, like an older phone number that you grew up with, that's no longer being used, or your grandmother's phone number, something like that. You don't have to provide it. And I always ask, why do you need it? Is it really necessary? And most of the times they'll say no. So I think from a safety perspective, think about it. But I mentioned from a mind shift, I would really like to say, though, that from the future, the technology of blockchain is simple enough from a logical perspective. It's starting to be adopted for many different types of transactions. So we talked about cryptocurrency. We're also looking at it from a medical history perspective, educational tracking and transcripts. I shared the logistics example, and supply chain pieces to be able to trace countries where components is coming from. And so that's one of the things you want to know. It's from like ecologically sourced areas. So shift your mind and think about, this is something that really could be popular in the future for tracing transactions in a distributed way, and be open to it. It's okay to have change. So with that said, I want to share a little bit more about the service learning. It's a program here at University of Detroit Mercy that helps students see issues in people's lives that lead to compassion, justice, and hopefully action. So I really hope you add this as a to-do list to use a password manager and put the complex passwords in place, at least for your email and then your social media accounts. This project really helped motivate me to reflect on what the public might see from a security professional to you, what you might have questions on. So I hope this helped you with that and to perform a service for you. So it shares a point in time viewpoint. It's 2021. Hopefully in a few years, this will be really widespread. But I hope that you're open to exploring new technology. We're doing this presentation was made possible by Dr. Ann Conkey and Father Tim Hipskind. If you have any questions or want to learn more about the program, I've got their email addresses included here, and I really appreciate your time. Stay safe.